Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Abby Love, and I am Scale's Senior Specialist for Program Quality and Capacity Strengthening. Next slide, Suzanne. Before we begin, we want to make sure that everyone knows that French interpretation is available today. So click on the small globe at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation, and then select your preferred language. You can choose English or French. And once you've selected your language, you can choose to mute the original audio, or you can hear it in the background at a lower volume. If you have any technical issues during the session today, please send a message to Scale, and we will do our best to assist you. Also, we invite you to use the chat box throughout the session to ask questions or share any reflections. We're really hoping for an active discussion today. Next slide. Our agenda today includes a quick introduction to Scale and to Bodhi Global Analysis for those of you who may not be familiar with us or who maybe haven't engaged with us in a little while. And then we will dive into some of the final evaluation's key findings and recommendations. We'll do that in breakout groups, kind of grouped by finding areas, and come back together to share those key takeaways before we close at the top of the hour. Next slide. So as many of you know, Scale is designed to support research, capacity strengthening, and knowledge sharing for implementing partners of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And our aim has been to strengthen the impact, sustainability, and scalability of agriculture, natural resource management, and off-farm or non-farm livelihood activities for both emergency and non-emergency contexts. We've been implementing the last 5 years, led by Mercy Corps in partnership with Save the Children, and we're ending in November of this year in just a few months. Next slide. And over the last 5 years, we've been working to support implementing partners in a number of different ways. For example, creating technical tools and training guides, such as Make Me a Change Agent, the Facilitator Guide, or the online course, Resilience Design Facilitator Guide, things that are in support of implementing partners' technical areas. On the capacity strengthening work, we've done in-person and remote training, as well as learning groups, for example, a SEEDS learning group that just concluded last month. Knowledge sharing and skills exchange, such as webinars or regional communities of practice, and then learning and research, learning briefs, case studies, impact assessments, all in support of implementing partners' impact, sustainability, and scalability. And so given all of these support activities, the investments over the last 5 years, we decided to conduct a final evaluation of Scale's work to learn a little bit more about what was effective and what could be improved going forward. We are expecting a follow-on award to begin early next year, which will be combined with ProWash, which is our sister award over at Save the Children that focuses on water, sanitation, and hygiene. And so this is a really timely discussion for us to dig into some of these key findings, the recommendations, and what that means for our work going forward, or other kind of food security support awards that are working with BHA's implementing partners. Next slide. So about 8-9 months ago, we contracted Bodhi Global Analysis, which is an international development consultancy that we contracted them to do our final evaluation. They've been digging into a lot of data, talking to a lot of you, which you'll hear about in just a moment. And so with that, I would like to pass it over to Brian Law, who's been leading the work from Bodhi's side, and he will take us into the final evaluation findings. Thanks. Oh, and just to note, I encourage you to use the chat box as Brian goes through these finding areas to ask questions. We will have a pause about halfway through the findings for a few questions, and then we'll have a bit more of a Q&A at the end. However, we will be going into breakout groups to really dive deeper into the findings. So a lot of your questions we hope will be addressed during this discussion. All right, Brian, over to you.
Great. I was just going to show a video just to say hi really briefly, but then I'll turn it off just because of connection issues. Great. Thank you, Abby. So we'll start by giving some background on the final evaluation and its methodology. Next slide. So Bodhi Global Analysis was contracted earlier this year to undertake the final evaluation of SCALE. The evaluation purpose was to assess the SCALE Award's relevance, effectiveness, impact, and sustainability. It gathered lessons learned and provided recommendations for the next stage of SCALE and for other similar programs. The evaluation framework was structured along 13 evaluation questions, covering 4 areas. The first was program design, so looking at SCALE's strategic approach and how it determined what support activities to provide. Second, effectiveness and impact, looking at how IPs benefited from SCALE's support activities. Engagement efficiency, so looking at how SCALE initiated contact and built relationships with IPs. And sustainability, looking at what will happen to SCALE's knowledge in the long term. Next slide. The evaluation used a mixed methods approach, collecting data from a number of data sources. First, we did a desk review, looking at the program design documents, program reporting, and activity TORs, plans, and reports. Second, which is a big bulk of our data collection, we collected qualitative data. We did 35 key informant interviews with the SCALE team, USAID staff, and IPs, and other stakeholders. We also did 4 focus group discussions with the technical committee and with the regional communities of practice. Lastly, we collected quantitative data through an online survey. This was done with ProWash, who was also conducting a final evaluation at the same time. We reached out to stakeholders through newsletters and other SCALE list servers. So this was a self-selected sample, people who chose to respond to the survey. And we received 72 responses in total, and 40 came from IPs, including both RIFs and so non-emergency and emergency programs. Next slide. So we'll now look at the key findings and recommendations that came from the final evaluation. Next slide. First, I just wanted to provide a quick overview to show the 6 finding areas that we'll be discussing. These were chosen because they roughly covered the main sections of the report and are key areas that we thought would be useful to have further discussions about. The first 2 areas look at how SCALE interacted with IPs. Finding area 1 looks at the channels SCALE uses to understand the overall needs of IPs to inform SCALE strategy. Finding area 2 looks at how SCALE initiated engagement with individual IPs to start providing this support. The third and fourth area looks at SCALE's approach to providing support. So area 3 looks at how SCALE chose its focus areas to address the capacity gaps of a wide range of IPs. Finding area 4 discusses the importance of localizing support to suit IP-specific contexts. The last 2 topics look at the lasting impact of SCALE. So number 5 looks at how well SCALE is designed to ensure sustainability of its knowledge and resources. The last area looks at how SCALE's relationship with a range of IPs and with USAID make it well placed to facilitate connections. Next slide. So our first finding was that SCALE had effective channels for learning about IP needs to inform their overall strategy. And by strategy, I mean the choice of thematic focus areas and which support areas to prioritize. The diagram here shows that SCALE used both formal and informal channels to learn about IP needs. Next. So formal channels provided more structured conversations. And they included the technical committee, which met bi-monthly and included representatives from a number of IP organizations. Roundtable consultations, which were discussions on specific thematic areas with relevant IP actors, and conversations with the donor. Informal channels provided Scale with the opportunity to speak with a wider range of IPs. And this included email, phone exchanges, discussions during the webinars and learning events, and one-on-one discussions during mentoring and coaching sessions. We should note that Scale is able to use these channels effectively to inform their strategy because of their adaptive model approach. So Scale's support activities were always open-ended and flexible in order to be catered to IP needs. This was helped by Scale's flexible budget, the resourceful staff, and the team's positive relationship with USAID donors. Next. So from these findings, our recommendation is for Scale to leverage more perspectives from the full spectrum of IPs through more formal consultations with unrepresented groups and underrepresented groups. For example, with emergency programs and with IPs from regions that Scale has not had much engagement with. Next. So finding area 2 is about Scale's engagement approach. We found that Scale took on a demand-driven approach to engage with a wide range of IPs. So during the inception phase, during IP inception phases, Scale's key strategy was to make introductions at the PCS workshops. So although IPs were quite busy during this time, Scale found that initiating contact with at the workshops, then having follow-up discussions, often led to successful engagements. Often this would lead to IPs and Scale establishing engagement plans to prepare support packages that would usually include training and additional coaching and mentoring. If Scale wasn't able to build a relationship during their inception phase, another strategy that Scale used was to initiate contact during IP's implementation phase. And they would do this by proposing collaborations with IPs. This included requesting IPs to participate in webinars, for them to present case studies, as well as to collaborate on research papers. Building a relationship this way often led to IPs understanding and learning more about what Scale does, which led to IPs to start asking Scale for additional support. Next. So our key finding here is that Scale's demand-driven approach meant that they engaged with the most responsive IPs. However, it is more unclear and it's difficult to gauge whether Scale has reached those most in need. The second finding is that regardless of timing, IPs were satisfied when they were fully aware of Scale's support offerings and were able to discuss their needs with Scale. So it's not the case that the more support an IP gets equals more impact. No. Next. So based on these findings, our recommendation is that Scale continues to provide support to IPs based on demand, but also take a comprehensive approach by initiating contact with all IPs. That way we can ensure that all IPs are at least aware of Scale support. The aim here is for Scale to reach IPs most in need. So they may not have the capacity to engage with Scale, but at least the important thing is that at least they know that they have the opportunity to do so. Next. So finding area 3 is about how Scale addressed IP capacity gaps in terms of thematic area. We found that Scale effectively supported a range of IPs by addressing both common and niche thematic areas. The diagram here shows a range of support activities that Scale offered to IPs and their approach to each of them. For capacity strengthening activities, since they require more resources to develop, Scale's approach was to design training packages around common topics that most IPs would find useful. So this included training on permagarden, resilient design, and social behavior change. At the other end of the spectrum, Scale provided ad hoc support or support by request, which would be on more niche and specific topics. For example, a number of IPs requested support on case studies, research reports, and evaluations on very specific topics relevant to their program activities. They can be as specific as, for example, one IP asked for support on their evaluation of their agriculture information management system, or another IP asked for support to conduct an economic analysis on their program's links to the private sector. In the middle, you have learning documents and knowledge sharing events, which can cover both common and niche topics. Next. So our recommendation is that Scale continues to do this, that they continue to focus on both areas that can benefit a wide range of IPs alongside niche support topics to meet more specific capacity gaps. We found that this was an effective way for Scale to allocate its resources to effectively support a wide pool of IPs. Next. So finding area 4 is about the importance of localizing support. We found that Scale knowledge has been applied by IPs in the programming when there is support to adapt and localize learning. And again, this doesn't matter if the support is related to topics that are common or niche. All topics require some adaptation to local contexts. The diagram here shows some examples for the different support activities. For learning documents and technical tools, which can be, again, on common or niche topics, we found that knowledge is often applied by IPs when they are complemented by other support activities to help with interpretation, to help with adapting learning to the local contexts. And the main example here is that technical guides and training manuals were found to be more useful when complemented by training activities, which often include some form of localization of the techniques to IP-specific contexts. As for knowledge sharing events, our finding is that because these events are often are not often complemented with support to adapt findings, they have not been applied as much. However, IPs found the main purpose of these events to be more about inspiration and sharing successes, and not always meant to be directly applicable anyways. For capacity strengthening activities, it was very clear that knowledge was applied by IPs when the training was tailored for specific regions and when follow-up support is provided to adapt techniques to local contexts. Most respondents would mention the value of post-training visits, so that conversations can be all about the practicalities of implementing new techniques and concepts. Next. So based on these findings, our recommendation is that Scale prioritize working with local consultants and with local training centers when delivering training packages to ensure that content is fully adapted to the local context. This can also mean involving regional consultants when developing learning documents, so that there could be a section, perhaps in the annex, on how IPs can adapt learning to specific regions. So with this recommendation, we wanted to hear back from you. So if we go to the next slide, we have a quick little poll here, saying how you guys might have different experiences working with local organizations. We want to ask you through this poll, have you engaged with local organizations or training centers to help you tailor your training content to local contexts? So if you answer yes or no, that would be great. And if you answer yes, it'd be great to learn a little bit more about your experience. So if you could write in the chat box the type of the type of training that was focused on, and then the local organization as well as your location, just to provide us a bit of context. And sorry, so, and then we'll take a little break for a bit of Q&A if there's any questions in the chat. And sorry, Suzanne, if you'd be able to tell us how many people have responded, I'm not sure if I can see that.
We have about half of people who have responded, so perhaps we can share the poll in a second.
Great, yes, we'll give a little bit of extra time there. Great. Oh, that's great. That's good to hear. So about 2/3 have engaged with local organizations, and the third haven't. For those who have, that'd be great if you would share a little bit more about your experience in the chat, the type of training, the local organization that you engaged, and your location.
Brian, while we're waiting for folks to share their responses in the chat, we have not received any questions, which is a bit shocking. Feel free to add them as well, participants. But if there are no questions, then yeah, we can just go on to finding 5. And then if you are interested in this topic around localization, local training centers, you'll be able to dig into it deeper in the breakout group. So Brian, I think we're fine to move along to finding 5.
Great, thank you. Great, next slide then. So finding area 5 is about the long-term sustainability of Scale's knowledge. We found that Scale has taken steps to ensure sustainability of its resources and knowledge. In a lot of ways, sustainability has been built into its approach. So this diagram here sort of takes you on a little journey of how knowledge is used immediately, to the medium term, to the long term. So Scale's immediate impact is that IPs apply knowledge from Scale's resources and support into their activities. Through our discussions with IPs, we found this has happened a lot. For example, resilient design techniques have been incorporated into their program activities. Social behavior change training has been incorporated into IP's staff training. And then in the medium term, Scale has built, as I mentioned, Scale has built sustainability into its model. So for example, Scale's training takes on a TOT, training of the trainer model, whereby IPs replicate the training they receive from Scale to the rest of their staff, which then gets passed on to the community and to their other beneficiaries. One key challenge to note here is that maintaining the quality of training can be a challenge. In terms of knowledge and tools, IPs have noted that they have integrated their practices, integrated knowledge into their practices and into their library of tools, and that Scale resources that they have will continue to be shared. But so how does Scale aim to improve the sustainability of this even longer? We found that in the long term, so beyond the program, Scale has also adapted its training resources into e-learning modules. So adapting its permagarden and its social behavior change training sessions into an online training platform. This will ensure that resources can be used in the future without Scale support, and this will also act as refresher courses to help maintain that quality of training. So in terms of further methods for sustainability, I'll jump to our recommendations. So if we click next. The first is that Scale should engage with local entities to use Scale resources. And again, this ties back into our previous recommendation of engaging with local consultants and local training centers to help IPs adapt knowledge to their very specific contexts. Here, the goal is for Scale resources to be continued to be used in the long term. So as IPs only last for a number of years, local entities, which are longer lasting, they will be able to continue Scale's impact. The second is for Scale to continue investing in e-learning modules, again, to maintain the quality of training and for Scale resources to continue to be used beyond the program. Lastly, we think Scale's learning documents and webinar recordings can be valuable in the long term. So our recommendation is to maintain some kind of a directory or platform for these tools to be used in the future beyond the program. Next slide. So finding area 6 is about how Scale can facilitate connections among stakeholders. The diagram here shows Scale's connections with various stakeholders. Obviously, the main connection is Scale and the various IPs. Scale provides support to IPs, and that's also through support of other associate awards like ProWash, and they also connect IPs with external consultants and other organizations. But we found that Scale was well placed to facilitate communication among IPs. Through its support activities with IPs, Scale has created platforms for IPs to meet, connect, and learn from each other. And this includes the regional communities of practice, learning groups, but also through informal opportunities to discuss during webinars and other events. We found that IPs have appreciated these opportunities to network and have actually requested more in-person events, longer sessions, and additional opportunities to learn one-on-one from each other. The second main thing is because of Scale's relationship with IPs, USAID has welcomed and relied on Scale's understanding of IP experiences to influence their decision-making, even if a lot of it happens through informal channels, through informal discussions between Scale and USAID. Next. So our recommendation is to leverage this further and to continue doing this. So first, for Scale to facilitate more informal networking opportunities through more in-person knowledge sharing events and through longer Q&A sessions. Secondly, we think Scale should continue acting as an informal conduit for collecting IP feedback on USAID processes to feed that back to USAID and BHA. So next, so those are the 6 key finding areas with the key findings and recommendations. And we can pause here for a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll go into our breakout sessions.
Thanks, Brian, for going through those. We have one question from Carl Wall, who's asking if we have any idea how or who has utilized the training resources, the tools, etc.
Yes, and it's just to say too that the report will be published at the end of the month, which provides a lot more details. I think the finding areas that we focus on here, I think focus more on sort of the approach and the model, but the report will have more details about how each of the main activities have been used and how and sort of and the results of the online survey. But yeah, but briefly, yeah, in terms of how they've been used, I can briefly talk about the 3 different sort of main support activities. So with the learning tools and yeah, learning tools and the training manuals and all that. Well, although sorry, I just want to say, does that make sense to sort of go through all that? I mean, it is more in detail in the report, and I wonder if I might sort of be quite rambly if I sort of go through the different areas.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Carl, I think for the interest of this setting, I think we're better placed to dig into the specifics of the numbers, the types of IPs, the regions that implementing partners are coming from, saving that for the detailed report that's coming out. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a general response would be, as Brian mentioned, that the IPs who kind of fully understood Scale support and was able to get the support that they requested and kind of work with Scale on an engagement plan that fit their needs best, those are the ones who are most satisfied with the types of support, whether that was the training tools or materials, or having a case study or learning document written on their behalf or alongside them. But in terms of kind of utilization of these different things, the details, I would say, we'll save for the report.
Yeah.
And then Aaron just asked a question on finding 5. Suzanne, maybe we can go back to that slide. In order for local entities to be more focused on sustainability purposes versus implementing partners, what needs to happen? What would that look like practically, and what kind of resource deficits that local entities often struggle with would have to be addressed for this to be possible?
Yeah. So for this to take place, obviously it does require, first of all, local organizations that exist in the region. But also, yes, as mentioned, they need to have the capacity to take this on, to understand the content, and then to sort of continue the training onwards, sort of thing. So and that sort of discussion, that I've had with the Scale team, sort of thing, is how much resources and time, should be spent on training, on training and building the capacity of local organizations when its mandate is to focus on providing support to IPs. So that is sort of a key question, but that could be done through various ways. And I think just sort of engaging them from the start. So involving them with the training. So even if the training is done by the Scale team, sort of involving them right from the start, so they are participating, they are already working with the IPs, and they're already, and then they might even be able to go through the training a number of times. So the building of capacity of these local organizations could happen at the same time as providing support to IPs. So that basically needs to happen. Yeah, exactly. So if they're sort of brought along while that's happening, but then also brought along even earlier when new topics or new training material is being, as I mentioned, as they're being developed, and we can involve them early on, so they can then already have a say about, okay, well, I'm working in this local region. Maybe these are some of the specific adaptations that might need to happen. So I think it's just about involving local organizations right from the start. But in terms of taking this on fully, yeah, it'd be something that the Scale team in the next program would have to sort of do, perhaps sort of a little scoping exercise to understand what local organizations exist, what their capacities are, and also their willingness to take this on. They might have their own trainings available, and maybe, and may or may not be interested in taking on some of the topics that Scale has been providing to IPs.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box right now. So with that, I think I'll move us into breakout groups. And as Ali just put into the chat box, there will be discussions in the breakouts on this localization question. So Aaron, feel free to join one of those if you're interested. But just to say, there's a lot of you on the call are either from USAID, from actively implementing programs on the ground, or from kind of headquarter technical support staff, and are actively working with BHA-funded implementers. And so we want to give you a chance to think about and kind of marinate on these findings a bit more, and think about what that means for, do the findings resonate with you, the recommendations, how can we, further contextualize them, and then what does that mean for our work going forward? And so next slide, Suzanne. So we'll have about 30 minutes to go into smaller groups. We will have 3 breakout groups, and each group will have 2 of the finding areas. And we've tried to group them, kind of thematically. So group 1 is focused on understanding IP needs and engagement approach. That's those first 2 finding areas. Group 2 is on addressing IP needs and localization of support. And then group 3 is on sustainability of Scale knowledge and facilitating connections. And so in a moment, you'll see kind of a pop-up to choose which breakout group that you want to go into. And for those of you who are French or Francophone joining us on the call today, we unfortunately will not have the interpretation feature in the breakout group. So as a result, we'll ask all of our Francophone partners to join group 1, where we'll be working on a document that's also translated in French. So please join that group. We'll give you some more details once you're in there. But Anglophone partners, you're also invited to join group 1. It will be mixed. And then, yeah, groups 2 and 3, I'll be facilitating group 1. Group 2 will be led by Jen Mayer from Scale, and then group 3, Ali Blumenstock from Scale. And then there's somebody from Bodhi in each group as well, who's from the evaluation firm. So I think with that, we can, you will choose your breakout group once it comes up and choose which room you are most interested to join. And then we will see you there in just a moment. Great. Hi, everyone. It's good to see a few of your faces now that we're back in plenary. We want to take a few minutes just to share some of the comments or discussion points that came out in our breakout groups. And just a reminder, you do need to check to select your interpretation language again. So go to the bottom of your screen, click your globe, and click English or French. And so I guess I'll start since I have the microphone and my groups. We're finding number 1 and 2. So as a reminder, finding area 1 was on understanding implementing partner needs. And this is kind of understanding IP needs to inform Scale's overall strategic direction. And the recommendation was further leveraging perspectives from a full range of implementing partners through more formal consultations with or underrepresented groups. And the main discussion from our group, and we only really got to this finding, we didn't get a chance to go into finding 2 very much, but our discussion focused on a few underrepresented or unrepresented groups, one being emergency partners, and another being local government, local extension services, organizations, and service providers. Those were kind of grouped together. And we talked about, for those different groups, what are the platforms or ways in which Scale should consult those groups to inform its strategic direction through roundtable discussions, online forum, things of that nature. So for the emergency partners, we talked about, the sector working groups, the livelihood sector working group, the food security cluster meetings, areas like that to engage a broader set of emergency IPs. And then also maybe more announcements on the markets and crisis group to reach some of those emergency partners. On the local stakeholder front, so the extension workers, local organizations, service providers, we talked about, how the local networks need to be brought in from an early stage, and that will differ based on the different contexts that we're in. But trying to, get information from local networks, training centers for local government extension workers, local agricultural universities, to having conversations with those stakeholders from an early stage of engagement with an implementing partner. And then Precious brought up the point that the cluster meetings are also a good place to reach local organizations and government stakeholders as well. I guess I'll pause there. Anyone from my group, Eric, Precious, Jonas, others, was there anything that I missed from our group?
Abby, just mentioning about the emergency partners, it's very tricky when it comes to engaging with emergency partners because you have during emergencies you have the projects that are 6 months to a year at a time, and it may not you may not have the same partner the following year, so it's a little bit of a challenge, and just wondering whether the type of engagement for emergency partners should be kind of probe a little bit more and seeing, for example, are we looking at emergency partners who are working in more of perhaps the recovery space or having a more multi-year type projects, or are we looking at the ones who are coming in quickly, doing emergency work and moving out? So we have to kind of look at that too. It's really important building their capacity, but the question is how, because you have different phases of emergency you have to look at.
Yeah, thanks, Precious. It's a great addition. Well, I think like I said, we didn't really get a chance to go into our second finding, which is okay. We will pass it to, I guess, Jen, who was the facilitator for the other two, or the next two finding areas, to share a little bit from your group.
Sounds good. Thanks, Abby. So we spent most of our time on the first finding area, which was around addressing IP capacity gaps, and had a really interesting conversation around a couple of different questions. One that we spent some time talking about is the flow of ideas and the influence of like what themes and what kinds of approaches Scale ended up supporting IPs in, and that the flow kind of felt like it was from Scale to the IPs, and that it would be interesting to know more about how potentially older programs like DIFSAs and going further back might have had more influence on the kinds of supporter themes that Scale provided in those earlier days, or how some of our support and focus may have shifted based on IP feedback even during Scale. During these past 5 years. So that was an interesting conversation, and one I think is really important for the next phase of this program. One of the things I mentioned as being really interesting and exciting for us on the Scale team is the opportunity to start looking at sort of post-action, post-program evaluations in this next phase. And that might give us some good insights there, but I thought that was a really interesting part of the conversation. And then also spent some time talking about the impact that COVID has had on in-person sharing and exchange opportunities, and the limits that has put on sort of the generation of new ideas, and the ways that IPs can actually talk to each other and go, oh, that's a good idea, and try out things and learn from each other in a more direct way, just because there are so many limits to eventually in online communities of practice, and webinars and such are great, but it is kind of limiting in that way. And there was Christy was wondering, for instance, as we go back to more in-person opportunities, if we'll see a shift there, and that shift could only really be positive when it comes to generating new ideas. And then there was a question about Scale's efforts to support integration across sectors, for instance, nutrition and ag, nutrition sensitive ag, etc. And we did do some of that, but I wasn't sure sort of what the solid outcomes were from those efforts, and if that's something that either Abby or Bodhi can speak to, that would be great. We didn't spend a ton of time on the second finding area just because we were running out of time. But the consensus seemed to be that contextualization is really critical, but that it also takes a great commitment and takes time, not just from the likes of support mechanisms like Scale, but also from the teams working in the communities and the IP staff working on the projects, that it takes time, it takes resources, and it takes great commitment to working through all the kinks and coming up with a contextualized tool or resource that works for that program. I'll pause there in case others have things to contribute.
Well, Jen, I just
Or
want
if
to say,
Brian or Avi have anything to say. Go ahead.
yeah, I'm just looking at Sarah's question. The question was, to what degree did Scale find requests to help on integration, like bringing in colleagues working on nutrition to work on nutrition-sensitive agriculture? Did this come up in the evaluation or in Scale's work? And Sarah, I think the example that's coming to mind is really the Make Me a Change Agent work. You know, that's requests from ag technical people saying, yeah, we need more support around social and behavior change methods, and Scale working with ProWash as well as SBC, the SBC core working group, et cetera, to adapt the Make Me a Change Agent guide to be more relevant for agriculture and livelihood staff. And then that continued to be a request from various programs going forward. That's the one that comes to mind, top of mind, but then also thinking like even our permagarden trainings, you know, the program teams would say, okay, we want to send our nutrition staff, gender staff, SBC, resilience. It wasn't just like your ag technical team joining those types of trainings or events, but the IPs recognizing like, okay, this is an integrated activity. We need people from various parts of our team joining that. So those just popped into mind. Ali, maybe I'll pass to you for the third group. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Abby and Jen, and everyone for their contributions. Our group was tasked with discussing the sustainability of Scale knowledge. And again, similar to other groups, we mainly focused, actually entirely focused on finding area 5, which around the sustainability of Scale knowledge. We didn't make it to the additional findings and recommendations. And we mostly focused on this question around, what is your experience of passing down or cascading training to other team members and or community members, and what has helped maintain quality, and what were the challenges? We had a great discussion. I mean, there are a lot of challenges, and people brought up those challenges of cascading. Suzanne had mentioned, the importance of training of trainers support, but I think Carl jumped in with, it cannot just end with training of trainers. We need to have continuous follow-up. The idea of mentorships was tossed around, and what does that look like? And I think Scale has done some work around mentoring and doing sort of a mentoring initiative, but I think that's an area where we're interested to dive in and further in Scale 2.0 and really figure out how we can best equip team members to be able to cascade in a quality way. And I think another point that came up that Carl mentioned is the importance of sort of evaluating training and reflecting on whether it's working, and how they're being used by team members in terms of training resources, and having those follow-up conversations with participants about how they're using the training, challenges they're facing, and what additional support or training would be useful. I think we also, Precious, your discussion about the challenge around emergency programs, that also came up. When we're talking about training, this is particularly challenging with these emergency programs that are 6, 12 months. If we're thinking about cascading and following up, that makes it's very difficult to do that when we're talking about such a short program cycle. And so trying to figure out how we might be able to do that when we know that the emergency programs are happening in protracted crises, and that they're probably going to get continued funding or have continued activities, but what does that look like when the program itself is only 6 or 12 months? So that's just another sort of challenge. And then I thought, Sarah brought up the FFP, the Fanta the sustainability factors, which I think are really interesting. So around motivation, linkages, capacity, and resources. So this need, and then Suzanne jumped in and added like the need for manager commitments in order to cascade training, and the need for buy-in from management to be able to enable staff to be able to continue to cascade and have that be a priority when there's so much else going on. And I mean, we had a really rich conversation. I could probably go on, but maybe I'll leave it at that and see if Carl, Sarah, Suzanne, anyone else from the group wanted to add anything from our discussion. Carl, I think I saw you go off mute. Do you want to add anything or?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Abby, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Yeah, Allie, you got some kudos in the chat box for your great recap. Grand job. Just to say we appreciate everyone sticking with us through the breakout groups and adding your contributions. It's really helpful as we digest these findings further and think about what it means for the follow-on award. It's helpful to get additional perspectives that maybe weren't a part of the focus group discussions or the KIIs that Bodhi used to inform the report. So it's just helpful for us to have additional insights. And speaking of the report, as Brian said, it will be out by the end of the month. And then we're also planning to have kind of a 2-page summary for the highlights as well, in case you can't get through the 50 or so page report in the end. But there's a lot of richness in there. There are 13 evaluation questions we go into, Brian and the Bodhi team go into a lot of detail around regional breakdowns of feedback, as well as types of implementing partners, the level of engagement that we had with different IPs and what that meant for their responses to the evaluation questions. So definitely encourage you to look into that once it's available. We'll make sure to share the report as well as the recording for this back with all participants once it's available. And I guess with that, I'll just say thanks a lot. Am I missing anything? Scale team, Bodhi, just a huge thanks to Suzanne on the back end for supporting the webinar. The Scale team is here in force to help facilitate the groups, as well as the Bodhi team. You guys have really gone above and beyond to get a great product for both this presentation as well as the report. We really appreciate your partnership on that. And of course, thanks to BHA for funding us. And hope everyone has a great